All right, so we are live. Want to welcome everybody to the stream. Again, the topic today is very simple. Can we build without reparations? It's a conversation that's really happening, especially with what's going on in California right now. It's something that we need to talk about. So I have a panel full of unicorns, and I really mean that in the most legitimate sense. So I'm Dewan. I'm the host of the Blackjack Podcast. We talk about how the civil rights movement went left. You can find us on all platforms, Blackjack Podcast. And let me start. I do play favorites. I'm just going to be honest with you. I play favorites. I'm going to start with Dr. Sarah Vinson. Please tell the people who you are.
Hi, I'm Dr. Sarah Vinson, a psychiatrist based in Atlanta, Georgia. And yes, I do think we can build. However, I don't think we can catch up without reparations.
All right. Kyra Hardwick, she is a consultant. You know what? Let me let you introduce yourself because I feel like you're the better hype man for yourself than I am.
Oh, well, thank you. Kyra Hardwick. I'm the managing consultant for the Kyra company. My goal and my task every day is to make sure the right people, right processes, and right profitability models are in small businesses every single day, and to help build the supply chain with amazing small businesses that are ready to do great work. And my answer to the question is yes, we can rebuild, but it's going to take a long time to do it without reparations. But I believe there are some strategies we can employ to make it live.
All right. And another unicorn, Mr. Brandon Rule, you're on mute.
Yep. Cool. Thanks for having me, man. Excited to be here. Brandon Rule with Rule Enterprises, commercial real estate development and asset and investment management firm, now based out of Atlanta. I think the answer is yes, we can build. I think more so individually, collectively, we can come together and do it as well. But as the two have said before us, it'll take quite some time. So we can, but it's necessary to get that as well.
And last but not least, Mr. Ryan Wilson.
Good to be here. Brian Wilson, CEO and co-founder of The Gathering Spot. We are a private membership network that exists in 8 cities across the country with the main goal of building community. I do believe that, like everyone else has said, that it's possible to build, but reparations are absolutely necessary. We got here intentionally or with intentional efforts, and we have to be intentional if we're going to get to where we want to be.
Thank you. So what a lot of you all have in common is entrepreneurship. Okay. All of you are entrepreneurs. And so the question becomes, what about the notion that why can't we just build our businesses? Why can't we just practice group economics? Can we just do that? Is that not feasible? Is that not possible?
Well, I'll jump in right away. I'll say this. The answer is we can. It's still about the longevity of the journey. We're all at different places and phases in our life, period. We're at different state and stages of mind. Our worldviews are different. And so if you will, the scattering of all of our marbles will take a long time to collect them and bring them back together. So the idea of, I believe that collective and group economics does work, but I do believe it works with groups of like-minded people. So the idea of us having the ability to link chains across, the nation and come together, that's a task that no one's been able to accomplish. It wasn't even accomplished during slavery. There was no unified, true approach to slavery. So now post-slavery, what does that look like for us to find a unified methodology? I think there is just such a bridge between our journeys that we'd have to do it in clusters and find groups that we can really link in with. That's where community comes in, tight communities.
So let me challenge that a little bit. There have been models of unified action. I think, for example, of the Nation of Islam. They actually had an economic plan starting in 1964. Elijah Muhammad said, everybody save for 3 years, send them coins to Chicago, and we're going to reinvest it. And by the mid 60s, they have farms in states all across the country. They have slaughterhouse for meat in Chicago. They have businesses. Again, most of the civil rights organizations kind of took a different position where they were sort of doing policy advocacy and that kind of thing. But as far as having an actual plan, it wasn't there. So, Kyra, you deal with business operations all day long. What are our businesses missing? What's not there?
Pure operations. I'm in business because people, process, and profitability models are not all in sync. I'm in business because it's not in sync in our homes. For all of us across the globe, it's not in sync for us in our businesses. It's the old adages. If you look in your trunk, what's in your trunk? That's probably how you function daily, right? How does the backseat of your car look? I remember hearing that a long time ago. But bringing it closer, we start businesses for a ton of different reasons. different motivations, right? Some of us started simply because we struck gold and it was a good move and people kept pushing us and we were able to continue to produce revenue. That does not mean we built healthy operations. That does not mean we knew how to lead people. And so again, it puts us back in a position where we still have to learn how to do business in a way that's highly functional. So how do we start the right way so we don't have to go back and do a lot of the repeat work to dig ourselves out of the process issues that cause the profit leaks, et cetera. So to me, that's the cycle of life that we've all experienced, but that's what we're missing. We're missing that approach that tells us, we know there's no one way to do it, but there are some very specific anchors and pillars that you need to have in your business in order to be successful. That's just a foundational piece.
So let me ask you this, Brandon, because a generation ago, somebody who looked just like you, somebody like a Don Peoples, Mayor Marion Barry would have taken him to the side and say, look, man, we're going to get you a contract and get you going. We live in a world where that is not a reality anymore. 1989, the Supreme Court in the case Richmond versus J.A. Crossan said we cannot do preference. We cannot do redress through contracting. That is no longer a reality. And so how did you actually get started? And is there a viable path for other people to do that?
Yeah, I think yes, but so there is some opportunities. DC's doing it. Places in Wisconsin is doing it where they're prioritizing Black developers now. It didn't happen when I was getting started, but I do want to acknowledge that they are making efforts to prioritize Black-led development companies to be able to get land and take that land and be the developer in a lead capacity that historically was not there for quite some time. For me, really, it was just the education, right? The exposure and the education started it. And I just went down this path to learn everything I can learn about the industry. The industry is difficult in itself as it relates to creating wealth and building buildings and doing all of those things. But at the core of it, for you to get started, the barrier to entry is the education and the financial literacy around finance. The language of finance is really what I was focused on. And once I learned that, I was able to leverage resources to really execute upon a goal that 700 units later, 3,000 in the pipeline, I have a significant amount of wealth that I've created for myself, my family, but really looking to kind of pass that on. But there are some initiatives now I do want to highlight: DC, Wisconsin, and some other places that are focused on Black specific developers. But that's just very slow.
Yeah, my apologies. So Ryan, I do want to ask you this, because regardless of what race you are, regardless of what industry you are, most businesses will fail. That is just empirically true. Objectively, the numbers are that. So when we talk about bridging the wealth gap, we often talk about business. We got to do a bit. Well, if most businesses will fail by the numbers, is that a pathway to close the wealth gap?
No, I mean, it absolutely is a way to close the wealth gap. I mean, there's only really two ways to make money in America. You've got to invest in something, you have to start something. So we have to prioritize continuing to start things. I think that the mistake that we make a lot of times is that we have a shotgun approach to it, right? We have everybody at all times needs to be starting a business, and we start businesses, frankly, in the wrong categories, right? If you look at the research, we start in low barrier to entry businesses that don't have a lot of high growth potential, right? And when you have already in most communities a negative net worth as a community, so that trickles down to how folks are experiencing having access to resources individually, it's very difficult to go start a company in a high growth industry and not be capitalized to do it. Okay, solution, we've got to be more comfortable selecting where businesses and founders and companies that really do have the potential to scale, and doing everything that we can to champion them, right? Again, the shotgun approach here just isn't the method that I think is the most effective. What is it like for us to get really excited about 10, 100 companies in a city and go all in on trying to get them to another place to scale?
Yeah, Dr. Vinson, the reason why I really wanted you here today is when we have these conversations, we typically are speaking to, if we want to be candid, a more middle-class audience. Dr. King, towards the end of his life, he realizes, and he says this very openly, the civil rights movement really just benefited middle-class Black folks for the most part. And so he tries to bridge that gap when he goes to Chicago in 1966 with the movement, and he finds that that's not very easy to do. In your world, you do mental health forensics. You have clinicians that go to prisons all over the country and talk to people. We're not really including those people, those Black people, in these conversations. So again, how do we bring them into the conversation? I mean, it's great that we talk about our entrepreneurs who are getting grants and stuff, But a lot of the people that you're touching, that they're not in that conversation. How do we bring them into it? Is there a pathway?
Absolutely true. And something that's interesting about Atlanta, when you have so many Black professionals and so much Black wealth, is that sometimes it feels as if the divide is more along class than along race, the way it is in other cities sometimes. And it, as you're saying, a lot of times the lower class Black people are left out of these conversations. And it's really expensive to be poor. And it also doesn't afford you a whole lot of bandwidth to ideate if you're trying to just make ends meet. And I can tell you, when I worked in a juvenile justice facility that was 99%, kids who grew up in impoverished families, I would ask these young men, many of whom had tremendous potential, what they wanted to be when they grew up, and they hadn't thought about it. Or if they did, it was rapper or football player, because that was the only thing that seemed accessible to them. So we leave out Black people who are parts of different classes at our own peril, to our own detriment. And there's a lot of potential that we are not using or capitalizing on or developing because of that oversight.
So one thing to remember when we have these conversations, again, we like to highlight what's going well as far as middle-class Black people. But when the Civil War started, there were 4 million people in slavery, but there were 488,000 free Blacks. That is to say, there's always sort of been Black people doing a little bit better. That's not new in American history. So again, when we talk about how to bring up a collective, I'm wondering, how do we target that more specifically? And again, when people talk about business or group economics, let's really do the numbers. If this guy has $10, right, and we have $1, we can pass that $1 all day long. There's still $1 circulating. So again, how do we bridge that gap? Or if we talk about public policy, right? If we say public policy that helps everyone, if I increase $1 million by 10% and you increase $1 by 10%, that gap got even bigger. So again, how do we start to kind of target that on a policy level? What does that look like? Anyone?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think from the highest of the high, right? Like, the wealthiest people in the world get a significant amount of government subsidy, right? Even if we talk about Elon Musk ridicules the bottom for getting, tax breaks and affordable housing and things like that. But SpaceX has been awarded, $15-20 million worth of billion dollars worth of contracts and frankly subsidy between SpaceX, Tesla, et cetera. Another big thing that we have to just acknowledge, before we can move the conversation forward, is if you look at the public pensions, which predominantly is led by people of color and Black folks, is a large share of that. We manage less than 1% of those funds, right? If you think about $1 billion with a 1 to 2% asset management fee annually, if you're just managing that, you have a pretty healthy business off of the back of just managing the funds that frankly are Black dollars that are going towards white people. And if we look at addressing some of those issues in the asset private equity space, we can start to then create opportunities for allocators to, one, build businesses and hire people that are educated in this finance space and continue to grow that. And then two, allocate them towards the businesses that need them the most, that are frankly underfunded because of the lack of knowledge and or understanding around the businesses that we have versus the businesses that they're more comfortable with, and or just not going to a basketball game instead of a baseball game, et cetera. Oftentimes it's more about relationship than it is the true and actual business acumen of the person, the CEO, founder. So if we can address the first thing, aggregate the assets that rightfully are ours, frankly, we then can deploy them to more companies. And now we have a more sustained approach, to your point, to these companies being successful. A lot of the reason why the companies fail is because the lack of resources that they have, not necessarily the lack of talent.
I see. Ryan, it looked like you wanted to jump in there.
To Brandon's point, right, again, it's about being specific. It's about us deciding that we're going to take bigger bets with certain companies and in certain industries, right? And we do this all the time and accept that framework in a lot of other contexts, just don't do it here, right? So we celebrate, and I say this respectfully, where there's capital allocation in very, very small amounts, that is where it makes it very hard to move the needle, but then don't say anything about the fact. I'll use a very prominent example to try to demonstrate this point. OpenAI, the company that owns ChatGPT, this year will lose $5 billion plus. right? It's a big bet, right? It's a lot of capital that's been put into a very, very big opportunity. If it works out, it really works out. Obviously, the opposite is true too. You can't point to even anywhere close to a Black-owned business where a significant bet like that has been placed to give the company and the operators time to grow into full potential. We're always doing more with a lot less and expecting miracle results to come out, and that's very difficult. I believe that we are magical, right? But like making $10 out of a quarter is very difficult to have happen consistently.
So, Kyra, my question for you then, what are these businesses really? Because everyone say access to capital, access. First of all, what does that mean, right? Because people just say that as if I had more money, somehow I'm going to make a bunch of money. But we've seen, to your point, right? We've seen a lot of bets really fail. What are these people actually lacking? Are they not intelligent on the low, right? Are they not competent? Like, what is happening here? Do they not have the regulatory framework necessary? What's happening?
I mean, from Brandon to Ryan, back to this question, that was like a full circle because number one, access to capital is a concept, right? And the outcome of that is the demonstrated value of the capital you gain access to, if that makes sense. That's about as political as I can make that. It's a theory, right? Access to capital. Now, let me go deeper. The access to the education, to use the capital, to leverage it, is actually what access to capital is about. So when you're talking to when I'm talking to my bankers, they're like, it's about access to capital, but it's about access to education, to the collaborative community that helps you figure out how to maximize and have these negotiations and conversations about dollars that you want to be in the running for. So, right, Brandon spoke to obviously someone that's doing an amazing thing in the world of space and technology and all that good stuff in terms of Elon Musk. We might not like his character, but the model, just like, I'll just say it, Trump's model initially back in the day when it was all about the power of the, I forget, I won't even give the credit, but I forget the name of the book. But point is, y'all know where I'm going with this. The concept of education was what we were after. I want to understand how to do it. So when I talk to bankers specifically, I was sitting down talking to a high-end commercial banker about what our business owners need as we're taking them specifically through our programs, our accelerator. I said, I know we're going to teach them how to use the resources by teaching them how to build their business. But I need to understand what they don't know when they come to you. And so we literally sat at the table and she said, they need to know at this dollar amount, they need to have this. At this dollar amount, they need to have this document. We are no longer looking for this kind of financial statement when they cross over this $10 million threshold. So I'm trying to figure out where the gaps are, and the gaps start when you make your first $100,000, because for up to about $100,000, we can figure out what to do with that every day. But when you start getting into a different dollar frame and amount, you don't even understand the language that the bank is speaking, let alone understand how to prepare to give them what they want. So I'm gonna back it up one more time. When we think about what access to capital means, it is about you even just having the framework. What does the pathway look like so that when I get to my first $250,000, when I get to my first 250 million, what's the difference behind that? Where do I need to be? Because I'm the same leader. I've grown, made some bigger hits. I've got a little more notoriety, and we know the culture likes to ride on the tails of success. But I'm gonna say this. The hype behind all of that is that we don't stop and get the fundamentals. So to answer your question, short and sweet, is education. That's the access we need. When we get the money, it flows in. People will give you money. Why? Because you're smart and you know what to do with it. But if I don't even understand the framework, the idea, the concept, the doors don't open. When we started our company, when I started my company in my living room, I literally was charging people $250 an hour, and I had unrented space at a restaurant daily, 8 hours a day. I bought breakfast and lunch. I did my due diligence until I could afford an office. I started there, coming out of corporate, making six figures. I didn't know the journey. I learned it fast, but it was about getting educated, smart and fast. I'm going to attribute a little bit of that to my Detroit girl grit and a lot of that to my Houston community.
So I want to really press this education point.
Yeah.
Dr. Vinson, you work in academia also. One of the concerns I've always had when we talk about education, Amos Wilson talks about how education, the point of it should be to be able to solve your own problems, right? By and large, Black people are not educated to solve their own problems. We are educated to solve somebody else's problems, perhaps. One of the good examples that he gives is the more Black MBAs we have, the fewer Black-owned businesses. And so there's sort of a thing, are we actually dealing with education? And so, again, I want to go a little bit deeper with that. I love the example from Booker T. Washington's book, Up From Slavery. He meets this guy who was sold into Alabama from West Virginia. And he said, how many of you all were sold? He said, there were 5 of us. And he lists me, my brother, and 3 mules. Okay. So this man really thought he was on par with 3 mules. So as a psychiatrist and as an educator, when we say we need education so that our businesses and our economy can flow, what are we actually missing here? What's the secret sauce? Because we're missing a whole lot, because we got a lot of Black MBAs and very little Black business happening.
So I can't take credit for this, but there is a difference, right, between schooling and education. And you have a lot of people who have gone to school for a very long time, who through that process have become acculturated and who have bought into the system as it is and are not necessarily invested in, interested in, prepared to upend things as they are. And for Black people to progress, we actually have to upend things as they are, right? And so there's a way that you have to be educated, not just schooled, and be invested in using what you've learned at those tables to advance your own people or to advance your own agendas. And that's a difference that I don't think we talk about enough. Yes, my mom sent me to school, but I also had to read the autobiography of Malcolm X when I came home, right? And unless we are willing to pair kind of knowing the system, knowing how to navigate the system with a consciousness that is not centered in that system, it's going to be very hard for us to move forward as a people.
Can I have a tough time with the education component of this conversation. And I think on one hand, it is important for us to make sure that everyone has access to good information. But my problem, right, and that when we focus too much on just that bucket, is that it ignores the reality that even if you are to go and be well educated, right, and I'm not talking about just at the right universities, but even if you spend the time really going and building the network and learning all the things that you're supposed to learn, the reality is that the vast majority of those people that get to this magical place still are not about to get access to any meaningful capital, right? And so, like, it's tough to blame that and I think that's part of the way that racism works beautifully, right? Is that it allows you to like zoom in on something that is like a real issue. We do have a gap where people just don't know things, but it doesn't matter, right? And I really like regret saying that. I wish that was not a true statement, but go out and do it, right? Because the only other way to explain why we're not seeing the results, especially of this group of people, right? It can't be nobody that's getting educated with all of the. Again, it's kind of elusive too. Like, what exactly are we need to be educated on, right? I mean, if you go and talk to the people that we're comparing ourselves to, they don't know what's going on in business either. No one does. It's entrepreneurship, right? By almost definition, you're trying to build something that hasn't been seen before. So we're not that far behind in that sense. Why are we not seeing similar outcomes? And to answer the last part of your question, I will stop. The main thing that we don't have the benefit of is time. That's what cash buys. It buys time to go figure it out. When you do not have any time, then you have to make perfect decisions, and we are not perfect people, right? So that's why it's frustrating for me, because if someone gives you $100 million and a bunch of years to go figure something out, well, a lot of smart people will go figure out a business somewhere in there. We don't have the benefit of that time, and it's killing us.
Brandon, you wanted to jump in there.
Yeah, I did, man. I agree. I think education is, I mentioned a little earlier, the starting point, right? Like that's the minimum barrier to get the conversation started. But to Ryan's point, it doesn't create the opportunity for the capital to be there. So when I talk about access to capital, you asked the question, I think we have to look at it as it is. Capital is really 2 buckets. It's debt and there's equity. From a debt perspective, we don't have the collateral to be able to get business debt most of the time. And from an equity perspective, we don't have the complexion for protection, right? We are not getting what our counterparts are getting from the equity side of things. I think that's why I went from the top, because a lot of the gatekeepers are the ones getting the funds from the pensions and allocating it to the businesses that they are choosing to allocate it to, and or the smaller funds. Let's be honest, a $50-100 million fund is phenomenal, but that is a small fund, right? Until you start to get to $1 billion+ funds raises annually, an asset management business at the core doesn't work. And the impact that you can make, you can't necessarily get that until you have that level of scale. So until we start to get more of the people in those conversations, all of what we're talking about really is relevant, frankly, unfortunately, right? So education also, when we talk about going to school, we have the most debt. Why? Because when we get money, we don't pass it down to our children, we pass it up to our parents, right? Why? Mm-hmm. Because we have no rich uncle to pay off our student loans. The student loans compound. And if we look historically, we have more graduates than we ever have. But to your point, we have no additional wealth. The wealth gap has widened. So if we have more education and the wealth gap has gotten worse, I mean, that's your answer right there as it relates to the educational piece, right? That's the starting point for then what's to come.
Go learn about debt or equity and then go try to raise some money. You'll find that all you are is a well-educated person that's still getting no cash.
100%.
Kyra, were you going to jump in there?
I just want a small bite, and I want to go here with it because, and it's absolutely, I think, in support of the conversation or a question around what is it that we're actually learning. And I'll use this one example. I'm going to use this from my world of small business development, sitting across the table from a business owner making probably about maybe 1.2 annually in a very healthy business that has very failing operational function, right? But healthy financially. Okay. So let's take that into and understand the concept and how we see things. This goes back to what Dr. Vinson said about mindset, right? So systemically, we think the dollars equal the health in the business. That's typically the lens that small businesses are coming from. When we start pulling it back and I ask a question about margin, I want to understand, do you understand what your retained earnings are and how do you establish your framework in your business? Now we're getting down to the micros of what we're actually learning, right? I have my MBA. That's a reference, right? If you look behind me, many books, those are reference guides. But the fundamental fact is retained earnings actually does produce and tell you exactly how profitable your business is. But if you don't understand how to establish your margins on the front end and have a conversation with your accountant and CPA, we're talking about basics. Talking about $1 come in, how much stays. That's all we're talking about. If you don't understand that, I don't care how much you're making. You talk about what are we learning? Learn that so we can keep the dollars in. Then what do you do with those dollars? How do you distribute those dollars that you're retaining, right? What's the cost of doing business? What is your cost of goods sold? That's the stuff that we need to understand because that's the sustainable information that allows us to go back to the systemic issue that we have, which is the assimilation. We all want to do something. And I hate to use the all term, but the concept of doing something, being a business owner, chasing a dream. But I need you to understand the systemic assimilation of trying to do that, especially in a culture that drives success visually, is impairing us, tremendously. We got to go back and uproot that.
So let me just say this. Although some people make jokes because I'm light skinned, I'm a black man, right? Got it. Brandon can identify. So here's the thing. My dad and other people around me had to teach me some kind of hard lessons about dealing with the police. It's not that they were saying it's right. It's just the world that we have. And since this is the world that we have, son, you may have to do some things to get home tonight. Everybody with me? And so it is here. I wonder if we're not acknowledging the world that we have. And so when we talk about equity and raising and capital, this is the world that we have. And since we have this world, how do we navigate it? I go back to the example of the Nation of Islam. Again, I'm not a religious person, so I'm obviously not within the Nation of Islam. I'm just, looking at history. They were successful in taking a lot of low-class Black people. And again, by the time Ralph David Abernathy gets to Chicago in 1966, he said the people in Chicago with the highest standard of living were the Black Muslims, as far as Black people, who didn't vote, who didn't protest, who didn't anything, but they had a plan. I think about the 1992 riots. Stay with me. Tasha Harlan gets shot in the back of the head. Brian King gets beat. The people who got money after the riots were the Korean grocers. Why? Because they had a plan. They had an organization, the Korean Grocers Association, who said, we need to get our margins better. So let's develop a cooperative. And so a bank gives them $30 million for a loan. Companies like Coca-Cola, Coors, they all kick in $5 million to help them with. There's a plan. There's an actual plan, and they're being organized cohesively to do something economically. I don't think we've actually touched that part. We talk about how to promote individuals, individual entrepreneurs, but how do we actually move collectively as we see examples in history?
I mean, I think that's the genuine concept of community. That's why the village is still imperative, right? Across the board. So I agree with you, but I think that's where, if we go back to the very first question you asked, or the second question about how do we do this from a group economic standpoint, it's about like-minded people. They have like minds, like concepts, like focuses, and like focus, and they started to move. That's how you mobilize. That is what we've learned to be the way. It's community, but it's a community that has some centric belief, and they're moving against that. They're moving, I shouldn't say against, they're moving with it. So that's how you do it. I mean, when I think about how we're doing it in our world of small business, we help each other share information. We're providing the education, the micro levels of education, helping people move the nodule 10%, 20%. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that's changing it for us. So, when we think about the how, these are small communities that become mighty in influence, but they're small.
Dr. Vinson, is there a special barrier to community here from your perspective as a psychiatrist, as someone who understands history, proud FAMU alum? Is there something that we're missing in terms of community and organizing that?
Well, foundationally, this country relied upon dividing Black people, right? You couldn't have a plantation with so few white people and all these Black folks working on it unless the Black people were divided. It has been essential to how America works, and it continues to be, right? So there is a certain amount of intentionality that has gone into not having us come together, that has come into separating us, whether it's by class or by complexion or by, fill in the blank, that we have to decide that we're going to overcome as a people in order for that collective mindset to work. With the Nation of Islam, they did have religion that they could use to organize around, right? In the absence of something like that, what is it that we are going to organize around? And how is it that we are going to really have the tough conversations about, your brother is not your enemy, your immigrant from the Caribbean, from Africa, from your person on the West Coast, like that is not your enemy, right? We're fighting over what others allow us to have access to, but that's not where we need to be. And so, yes, we do have trouble coming together, but it's not because of something inherent to who we are. It is because of, something that we are uniquely up against as a people in this country and always have been. Okay.
I'm going to start to kind of land this plane a little bit. And what I'm sort of curious about, as we sit here today, obviously, I got a bunch of entrepreneurs I'm talking to. I also have a bunch of voters. And so as a voter, as people who are civically minded and engaged, I'm wondering if you could speak to public policy. Absent the reparations conversation, are there public policies from your lens in your world that sort of, again, ultimately we have a gap? How do we close that gap? Where do we need to be looking in terms of public policy? I just sort of go around the horn. Ryan, I'll start with you.
There's a lot of that's a big question. Going back to where we started, the only two ways to make money in this country are to invest in something or start something. So we need specific policies that help us to ease into doing one of those two things. As it relates to the start something piece, we've seen some recent policy proposals that I actually think would be helpful, right? So we do need, beyond reparations as we traditionally talk about them, we do need plans like what Vice President Harris proposed this week, which is to have a tax exemption to give people the opportunity to start companies and to be able to lower the cost of being able to do it. So anything in that space is where I'm going to stay focused. Home ownership traditionally been the bedrock of how people build wealth. We have to have very specific policy that helps people get into homes and be able to stay in their communities. Half of the reason why we aren't able to really control the communities that we live in is that nobody owns anything in them, right? So we need specific policy that helps to facilitate making that happen. So I can spend a long time in this bucket, but many of the policy proposals that we're talking about also rest on the idea that there's relationship there, right? That there's an active and engaged voter base that is going to demand that those things actually occur. And we've got to make sure that everybody that we're electing locally and nationally understands that if they do not enact these sort of policy proposals, we will be back and voting actively.
So I normally say ladies first always, but today we're going to do something else. Brandon, why don't you go ahead?
Well, now, first off, everything. So I think from a federal level, there are some thoughts, but I'll be succinct in just stating, I think at the core of this conversation, we need to be very clear about a Black specific policy. Regardless on what we say that specific policy is, I think a lot of the policies that we support are often wider than just us for various reasons. But if we have a Black specific policy, we can start to address the Black specific wealth gap. I think that we need to be very vocal about getting something for our own. Some of the positive things that I've seen on the local level that I think is, phenomenal is as cities aggregate land and are disseminating that through RFPs, prioritizing Black developers to be able to get said land is a way to equal that playing field. If you look at places like Hudson Yards, that was an RFP. You look at the wharf in DC, that was an RFP. And although they got those RFPs maybe 10, 15 years ago, land appreciation continues to happen. And if you can get those locked in at certain prices, whether it be discounted because, whatever reason legally you can make it that a Black person deserves a discount, and or give it at this point in time, let the land appreciate and mature and still be able to sell it at that previously determined amount, that equity right there is the equity oftentimes developers are using to do these bigger deals. And we don't get that. We have to go out to do private solicitation from private owners and pay maximum price. The funding that we get, the debt is more expensive for us because we're more risky. The equity is less available to us because we're more risky. So municipalities on a local level can start to level that playing field. Maybe there's a debt specific, maybe there's a bond specifically created to give loans to, Black businesses. You've seen new market tax credits, seen new market tax credit loan pools be low interest loans given to Black companies. Those are ways that we can really start to move the needle a little bit. But unless we are hyper specific about us as Black people being at the forefront of these initiatives, when they come out, we just get skipped up. And that history will continue to repeat itself if we don't stop it at a certain point.
Dr. Vinson, we give the floor to you.
So I can't agree more with the Black specific policies as a necessity. You always run up against political reality in enacting that. But absolutely, as a child psychiatrist as well, I always think about things developmentally, right? And when you have so many children exposed to poverty and violence, that impacts how their brain works, that impacts how big the world seems to them or can be for them. And so I think that there is economic policy and basic child welfare principles of housing, of food, of basic necessities before we even get to things like education and things of that nature. So that's where I would start.
And Ms. Kyra.
Yeah, thank you for that. Definitely think that, we've really pulled forward, I think, the essentials, but I'll add this piece. A big part of the infrastructure bill's workforce development, right, is trickling down over, into many of our cities. But one of the things I think that's important when we think about workforce development, that gets back down to the micros of learning, industry exposure, things of that nature, things that help us to continue to build and close our gap financially, is making sure that organizations down to community functional levels truly have access from a regulatory standpoint to those dollars that help us educate and increase the quality of our community's workforce. I'm talking about working age adults that'll come into our small businesses and leverage different skill sets or learn more about what's happening when it comes to climate action, energy, et cetera. Like, how do we continue to do that? We need access to that. And that is micro. Some of that is very technical. Some of that is just very exploratory education that may not be available to them simply because of their pathway. So I think it's important for us to make sure that workforce development programs and the policies truly direct themselves or are directed down to functional community-based levels.
And forgive me, I should have done this at the start. Kyra, again, you are a unicorn. Not only are you able to do business for yourself, you have been able to grow businesses and millions of dollars of revenue. So tell people how they can actually connect with you and what you're doing.
Absolutely. Kyra Hardwick with the Kyra Company. You can reach me on any of our social platforms. If you look and log into our favorite search tool and just Google Kyra Rennell, you'll find me. And what we want to be able to do is tie you to some of the educational programs that we have going on. Our Smart CEO community is where we do that work. So it's the space for business owners to learn and grow. It is designed for businesses that are growth stage. We are teaching the fundamentals, but much of what I've talked about today, but getting into the details with other business owners that are functionally and efficiently driving that in their own organizations. And so that's how you can reach us, the Kyra Company, the Smart CEO community. That's where I'm at.
Dr. Vinson, you may not want people to reach you, but if they were to reach you, how would they how would that happen?
So my only social media is LinkedIn, but Dr. Sarah Y. Vinson. My forensic mental health consulting company is Lorio Forensics, LORIO Forensics.com.
All right. And in the YouTube recap, I'll also put all these into the description. But notice she said only LinkedIn. She said, I'm better than y'all. I'm not basic. I'm on social. She's just so much cooler than us. Brandon, how can the people connect with you?
B_RULE, pretty much on all platforms, except for LinkedIn. It's just Brandon Rule.
And Mr. Wilson.
I'm Spot on RW or Ryan Wilson on everything. The company's The Gathering Spot. The Gathering Spot's on all platforms.
Cool. And on the way out, I'll just say to wrap it all up, thank you all so much. Again, I think we have to be very intentional in these conversations by talking about the collective and not making this individual pursuit. I can't talk today. And again, we have examples of history where people have had an actual plan, things that are easy to do. You don't need a plan. If you want to gain 20 pounds, you don't need any plan. Just start eating. If you want to lose 20 pounds, that needs a plan. I think we need a plan politically. I think we need a plan economically. And I think some of us just don't know what to do, particularly Dr. Vinson, some of the people that you deal with. I think there has to be greater organization. And Brandon, you hit it on the head. Like, it has to be Black specific. If the wealth gap exists, you're not going to close that gap by having policies that benefit everyone the same. That gap will only increase, and we have to be intentional about that. So again, if you want to hear more from me, you can find me, the Blackjack podcast. We talk about how the civil rights movement went left. Thank you all so much for joining. Next time.